It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Here's a take on the United States at 250 years old. It's a book with more than 100 excerpts of different things, I'll explain the context in a sec, from the nation's history. About what? About the history of religion in the country, from indigenous religions that the European settlers learned about when they got here, through the Puritans, Abraham Lincoln, atheists, feminist spiritualists, both Stephen Colbert and Donald Trump, believe it or not, the adoption of the motto "In God We Trust," which only came in the 1950s, and many others, including Malcolm X in the 1960s.
I'm a Muslim. I believe in the religion of Islam, which believes in brotherhood, complete brotherhood of all people. But at the same time that I believe in this brotherhood, I don't believe in forcing my desire for brotherhood upon those who aren't willing to accept it.
Of course, I think the Christians would say that they also believed in brotherhood. What did you say to that?
I'd say they believe in it, but don't practice it.
Well, that'd be a pretty good answer.
Malcolm X on the CBC back then. Our next guest is Ilan Stavins, professor of humanities and Latin American and Latino culture at Amherst College and publisher of the imprint Restless Books. His own new book, published by that imprint, is called A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. Hi, Professor Stavins. Welcome back to WNYC.
It's such a joy to be with you again.
Do you have a thesis in this book? We're going to go through some excerpts. I know you brought some things to read. I have a couple of clips. But is this just like a beautiful mosaic of people from, before the United States was a country, right up through Donald Trump, expounding on religion? Or do you have a through line here?
I think the main purpose of this is, first, as an immigrant myself, born Jew in Mexico, who came to the United States in the 80s, in the mid-80s. It is a love letter and a thank you note to this country that is so complex, and particularly through the prism of religion and through the vision of God. And maybe if there is a message or an argument, is that a country of 335 million people, a country with around 375 different faith groups in the United States, how is it that we all stick together? What do we say when we talk about religion? Do we all have a single God, or are there many gods, as many as believers and faith groups and religious institutions? And is it only us individually and nationally that are constantly wrestling and bargaining and fighting and embracing God? Or might it also be said that God looks for us in different ways, and God is also being changed in the process of America changing in 250 years or many more before the actual independence?
God changing. So that kind of accepts a premise that man created God rather than God created man.
Yeah, I think it's a dialectic between the two. Certainly, God is a projection of our fears to the unknown, our need for higher powers, maybe a desire to have some kind of authority entity or figure that narrates the story and with whom we feel comfort. But it is also that in this vast and very chaotic universe, the higher powers might be also looking for followers. And I believe in that connection between the two that is constantly being transformed.
All right, so let's do some sampling from the items in the book and from history. And many people might think of Christianity as America's first religion, but as we know, there were many indigenous people who called this land their home before the settlers from Europe did. The battle for land included a battle for culture, and you include, I guess we could call it a sobering 1854 speech by Chief Seattle, who said, "Your God is not our God. Your God loves your people and hates mine." And so, Ilan, that's tough stuff, and a competition of the gods in Chief Seattle's telling. What was the context for that?
Yeah, first let me contextualize this. This competition for God, for the attention of God, runs through our culture from the very beginning, and it's likely to go on till the end. Different groups use God to showcase supremacy or to denigrate other groups. Upon arrival, there were a variety of religious beliefs in the indigenous population, and the book showcases many of them, many different tribes who see other tribes as being different and likely inferior to them, but it is particularly against the white man, as it's being described in the 17th and 18th century, the white man that has come to impose a God that must be celebrated, must be bowed to in an unconditional way. Chief Seattle and others in the book of indigenous background say, do not, to their own followers, do not be fooled by that lie, that the sudden arrival of an outsider God is going to mess our own beliefs, and we should stick to who we are and what we have. It is the same premise that other groups, immigrant groups, slaves, other groups that have come and formed new religions here will constantly, recurrently be stating our God is the one that is superior and beware of the other ones. All in the context of the borders that keep on expanding in this nation, from the arrival of the Mayflower to the Manifest Destiny and the conquest of the new territories.
So that's in the context of that conquest. Do you have anything in there from one of your other indigenous sources that just kind of expresses a notion of God that, or a way to observe religion that the Europeans may not have been familiar with until they got here?
Yes, absolutely. The anthology actually starts with Navajo chants that, ironically, Brian, are very similar to maybe Buddhist or Hinduist religions. These are statements in lyrical form that pay tribute to nature as a manifestation of the higher power. And it is that nature that has to be taken care of, that has to be curated, that has to be bowed to. It is fascinating because it won't be until the mid 19th century, with figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Thoreau, and others, who will be the first ones that bring Eastern religions into the American fold, who are going to suggest that God is actually not an old man or not a crucified entity or a trinity. It is the entire cosmos, and that we are part of that larger chessboard, so to speak. This is an ongoing debate, and even within Western thought, the book states in a number of different places that by the time in 1776 this republic was found, the idea of the Bible as the only central document that proposed a vision of God that needed to be embraced, or you would suffer the consequences, had been debunked by European thinkers like Spinoza, among others, a major background figure in the shaping of what the founding fathers ultimately created in order to have the country that we have. And it comes very similar to the indigenous population that was before the arrival of Europeans.
If you're just joining us, listeners, my guest is Ilan Stavins, Professor of Humanities and Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, and author of the new book, A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. And it's more than 100 excerpts of religious writings or speeches from the 250-year history of the United States and even before. And if anybody wants to contribute to this in any way or ask a question, 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. There's an excerpt by Cotton Mather, who was a Puritan who believed witchcraft was real. He supported the Salem witch trials and also thought that slavery was God's will. But then 10 pages later, you also include the work of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, the first black woman to publish a book of poetry in the United States. She was born enslaved and had a deep faith in God. Can you give us context or even a taste of each excerpt?
Yes, but let me, before I do that, just stress that passing point that you made. That is what an anthology does. It creates connections between different authors that apparently are disconnected. And the fact that we are putting together these two, a slave owner and a proponent of the vision that the evil is spreading all over and that we have to be cautious, and who defended the Salem witchcrafts as Cotton Mather did, next to Phyllis Wheatley, I think shows what an extraordinary nation this is that can allow both to coexist in the same place. In his very important book, The Wonders of the Invisible World, Cotton Mather says that the devil has come down unto us with great wrath, that we find and feel and now deplore, and that we should be constantly on the alert to that force that might take us in the wrong direction. The evil in this case is a force that is even tempting God, and it's a force that exists in the universe outside of humans. Conversely, Phyllis Wheatley, a former slave, the first woman who ever wrote poetry, a very influential voice, in a poem called Thoughts on the Works of Providence. She concludes this beautiful poem, originally published in 1773, 3 years before the independence. Almighty, in these wondrous works of thine, says the last stanza, what power, what wisdom, and what goodness shine, and are thy wonders, Lord, by men explored, and yet creating glory unadorned. And Phyllis Wheatley might be said to be the forerunner of establishing social justice among us, because if God loves everybody the same, everybody should be the same as they relate to one another. So these poems, these stanzas, as beautiful as they are, they also have a political bent that will reverberate in our culture, in our literature for many, many, many decades.
You also quote the character Huckleberry Finn. That's in the book's introduction. And you talk about how the book is proof that even atheists wrestle with God. I mean, much of America is secular these days, and we're going to get to that. But what did the Huck Finn character say that can teach us about secular America's relationship to religion?
Brian, Huck is my favorite character in American literature.
Ah,
To me, it's ground zero. I adore him. And a 12, a 13-year-old is to me a role model in a society that is absolutely fragmented and bankrupt, that believes in slavery. This little child runs away and finds his own journey with a runaway slave down the Mississippi. What better image can we have of the journey that America has than these two individuals, two pariahs that are looking to find their own way of responding to the very challenging times that they have? And Huck, who comes from an abusive family, a drunk father, an aunt who is constantly beating him, at one point in the book has to decide between good and evil. He doesn't necessarily connect it with God. He hasn't developed a vision of God, but he knows that there's good and evil, and he concludes in having to choose between both of them that he is going to go for evil, meaning he's going to run away and he's not going to perpetuate the patterns of slavery and abuse that everybody else is doing in that time. So an atheist or an agnostic, a little kid, becomes a kind of a Buddhist figure or a master that teaches us all that sometimes we have to say no to institutions and to larger paradigms that are defining us and take the path less explored. I find that Huck Finn in many ways will be echoed by many others who are atheists. The book is filled with atheists and agnostics who, because they are wrestling with the absence of God. They try to figure out how to conceive of morality, how to engage with our neighbors in a way that is far beyond institutions. And that's a very American way of doing things.
Who's another example of that from the book?
There are many other examples in the book, some of them controversial. There are authors in the book that I think people will find surprising. There are many scientists in the book, like Stephen Jay Gould, who, as accomplished as he wrestled with the concept of God throughout his life and wrote very eloquently about it. Albert Einstein, an immigrant who ended up suggesting that God plays dice with all of us. That's also in the book. Of course, Christopher Hitchens, who believed that God is not great and wrote an entire book as he was facing death, already plagued with cancer. There is an especially significant poem in the book, Brian, that has a lot of resonance for me, as I am a grandchild of people who went through the Holocaust. It's by Katia Molodowski, and it's called God of Mercy. And it is a poem in which she, writing in Yiddish, tells God, please, please choose another people. We are tired of being the chosen one. We are tired of carrying in our shoulders the misery of the entire humankind. And I find this not only significant because I myself am Jewish, but because America is also built on the concept that we are the chosen nation, that we are exclusive and that God has pushed us to do something that will be a model to others, as an idea taken from the Hebrew Bible and from many other Jewish sources.
Again, listeners, my guest is Ilan Stavins, Humanities and Latin American and Latino Culture Professor at Amherst. His new book is A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands, with over 100 excerpts of things from all of U.S. history. Who has your own thoughts about wrestling with God, if you want to call it that in the context of the United States, how your religion, your practice, your atheism for that matter, or agnosticism, kind of intersects or comes in the context of being an American? 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692, call or text. You mentioned Spinoza before, and I think that prompted a call from Richard in Jamaica. Richard, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Oh, hello, Brian. Thank you. Another great program, feather in your cap. Yes, Spinoza, of course, he was a pantheist, and he believed that God and the universe are one, and that God was not anthropomorphic, so to speak. He believed that miracles were impossible, and the Bible is a work of human literature. So much so that he was excommunicated during his lifetime for that belief by the Amsterdam Jewish community. So that's just another facet of how we look at God and how we approach God.
Richard, thank you very much. Anything more on that, or how it connects with what you were saying about Spinoza's influence on some of the founders' religious sense?
It connects dramatically, and I thank very much the listener for his thoughts. Yes, this is a country of runaways. We started with the pilgrims, at least we started in the modern concept, but many of the indigenous people were also runaways from different tribes. It is a disservice to see them always as peaceful and amicable to one another in a country where we excommunicate, we censor people today because of their ideas. What happened to Spinoza is not unique. And so in any discussion of what the role that God plays, one has to take into account the kind of a elbowing that happens all the time of those that disagree and that push that individual with new ideas, with new views to the side, and eventually that individual gets a new quorum and finds a new religion and pushes for things that are newly American from a perspective that is unique.
And another listener, maybe related a little bit, writes, can you ask the guest about deism? Apparently, deism, not traditional Christianity, was the main belief system of many American founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, and others. It's a word you're familiar with, right?
Absolutely, and it plays a very important role in the book. It's a word that we don't use today, but it's the conviction that there is such a God and that God is above everything, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from one religious perspective or another. That God entity is the fountain of everything that we do, even when you ignore it or move beyond it. Washington and Jefferson, there's a piece by Jefferson on that. There are various other reactions, particularly in the 19th century, of the deism. But if I may, Brian, I want to simply mention the only author in the book that is actually a non-American. He wasn't born here, and he wasn't also an immigrant who came here. One could say that he was an ethnographer or maybe a tourist, an intellectual tourist. I'm talking about the great Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote that beautiful mirror that he gave us, the democracy in America, telling us how this Frenchman sees us. There's an excerpt in the book that serves as an epigraph. It is not from Democracy in America. It's from his book, The Old Regime and the French Revolution. And he says in it, I have sometimes asked Americans whom I chance to meet on their own country or in Europe, whether in their opinion, religion contributes to the stability of the state and the maintenance of law and order. They always answered without a moment's hesitation that a civilized community, especially one that enjoys the benefits of freedom, cannot exist without religion. In fact, an American sees in religion the surest guarantee of the stability of the state and the safety of individuals. This is, for some, a very controversial statement, but I think that religion, even without God, it serves as an organizing principle that has been fundamental for the shaping of this country in 250 years.
Now to something completely different. One person in the anthology might seem like a less obvious addition to some people. I mean, many might. But the one we're going to sample from is Lana Del Rey. You include her song, God Knows I Tried. Let's listen to a little.
God knows I love.
For the uninitiated, who is Lana Del Rey and why did she make it into your book?
Lana Del Rey is another example in the book, Brian, of the crucial dimension that is popular culture as a screen or as a space where we explore God. There is so much that we do in movies, in miniseries, in the lyrics of songs by Bruce Springsteen, by Bob Dylan, by many, many others. And I first wanted this not to be a book only by and about theologians. I wanted to show that it is all Americans that are always wrestling with God, and that wrestling manifests itself in all kinds of ways, in a cartoon, in a mural, in a children's song, in a hymn, in a sermon, in a speech. And Lana Del Rey, who has this exquisite voice, is a perfect example of that dimension that we're always looking. So we might find ourselves in the car listening to a popular singer that is connecting us with a religious religious dimension, or we might open the newspaper or surf the internet and find a cartoon or an emoji that connects us with God. That is also theology. That is also religion. That is also a manifestation of how we are looking constantly for some kind of validation, or at the very least for an explanation to the doubts that we have.
Listener writes, I think your guest overestimates how non-religious people, quote, struggle with the concept of morality or the absence of a God. It's actually quite easy, writes this listener. There is a rather large body of research showing how evolution shaped animal behavior and, by extension, human morality. So I don't know if you want to talk back to that listener, but maybe use that as the segue into the rise in non-belief, or at least religiously unaffiliated, these days in the country.
Yeah, I don't know if I would talk back, but I would talk with the listener. There is a clear sense that we are obviously creatures of evolution, and that the vision that we had in biblical times or in medieval times is very different from where we are today. But I argue, and this is a 65-year-old arguing, Brian, people, by the way, tend to become more maybe spiritual or have deeper questions about what will happen after life as they grow older than ignoring as many scientists or rejecting the concept of God isn't necessarily a way of making that concept absent. In the Origins of Species of Darwin, he spends the entire last chapter thinking that if there is an evolution of things, where does all this start? Could there have been a primary force that pushed the very first cell, the very first molecule? Freud, Einstein, Newton, all of them in one way or another, deep and very persuasive scientists themselves negotiated with higher forces, higher powers. And the same thing goes with artists. Artists like Shakespeare might be described as somebody who's hiding his religion. He's not an American, obviously. I'm just using his as an example. But ultimately, there is a palpitating desire among his many characters to understand larger causes, in Hamlet, in Romeo and Juliet, that I think never fully eliminates the concept of God. If we could do that, we would have done that. We would have eliminated the word altogether 50, 100, 200 years ago. I don't think it will ever disappear. And by the way, in the end, we're only talking about a word, God, G-O-D. And that word is spelled and it's pronounced differently in different languages, but every single language that I know, every single culture, in one way or another, accounts for this higher spirit with a word that tries to tame it, or at least tries to present it in a way that others can engage with.
Alon Stavins is still with us for another few with his book, A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. It's more than 100 excerpts from writings and speeches, songs, other things from the 250 years of American history, and a little before that as well. I think you brought another excerpt to read. I don't know what it is. So you want to set something up and read us somebody's words?
More than another excerpt, I'd like to talk, Brian, about some of the more controversial pieces in the piece, and because in a variety of forums, there has been the question of why include Alice Walker, for instance, or Donald Trump, or Woody Allen, or Cesar Chavez, now debunked as the farm workers leader, in an anthology about America. And I thought very deeply about all this when putting together the book. And to me, it is first and foremost a statement that God can be as divisive as he can be it can be unifying. And many of the people that have proposed views on God have themselves ended up with questionable moral careers or decisions that they made. If I were to cleanse the dialogue that Americans make for those that have stumbled or those that are bad people, quote unquote, then I think we would end up with just two or three, and even themselves in a very questionably, all of us wondering if you can be fully and perfectly presented and wrestle with this large question. I think it's important to hear the voices of those that are pushing us to question the periphery, the parameters, the essence of God, and how they used it and abused it. And certainly in America today, from the government down, people use God to alienate and to censor and to violently go against groups that they deem to be unwelcome, transgender, gays, immigrants right now, because they are undermining our society and they are barbaric and primitive. It all comes down to seeing them as not praying to our higher spirit, the one we chose or chose us.
So, cue Donald Trump, which I think you just did. And for a little bit of context, you recognize in the book, I see that President Trump obviously is not known for his spirituality, while there's this irony of his political base being dominated or led or inspiring the most faith, if we can use that word, by white evangelical Protestants. Now, right. Recently, Trump came back to invoking God as he accused communists of being godless. Listeners might recall he also recently used this term to describe New York's Democratic Socialist mayor, Zohran Mamdani. But here he is the other day speaking in honor of America's 250th anniversary.
The godless communist morality states that anything is justified to bring about inhuman visions and to really propose what's good. They don't want good. They don't love God, and they don't want God. They don't love religion, and they don't want religion, and they won't have it. But we will not let them win.
You want to put that rhetoric in context?
I would love to put it in context, but I have to contain my own discomfort and anger, I have to say. This is the ultimate transactional politician. He is not a believer in anything but making money. And in whatever way that fortune can be built, he is ready to bow down to idols and gods, no matter where they come from. This is a man who has known very well throughout his political career how to manipulate the evangelical Christians, or how to use terms of like anti-Semitism for his own purposes. I find it absolutely ironic and distressing, Brian, that a man who has done much evil in terms of abusing others, women in particular, can talk about a godless entity that are the communists or those that he doesn't sympathize with. But hey, this is American politics, and an American politician will go before their audience and say whatever this politician thinks that audience will want at that particular moment. And very few are as savvy, as rhetorically engaging to their type of followers as Trump is. So a godless president who talks about God in order to alienate those that he dislikes, very American.
Have you ever looked at the Soviet Union? And to be clear, not to conflate American Democratic Socialists today with, Soviet communists of yore. But have you ever looked at the Soviet Union in the context of your interest in religion and culture? And what was an explicit attempt to outlaw religion, right?
Absolutely. And this is probably one of the most interesting experiments, not only in terms of labor and economy, but in terms of spirituality. From the very beginning, with the Marxist Leninist view, the Soviet Union tried to outlaw and eradicate any idea that would come close to an institutional religion, only to find decade after decade that people spontaneously went for it privately in the comfort of their homes, and that by the time in 89 the Berlin Wall came down, many people immediately returned to something that had been prohibited in the country. The same thing happened in Cuba. Fidel Castro at the very beginning was adamantly against every single religion, including voodoo and Afro Cuban religions, only to find out that the only way that he could bring people together was to enable them and allow them, even though not officially from the state. And ironically, Fidel Castro ended up being quite a close friend of the Jewish community, for instance, in Havana, and allowing for the Afro-Cuban culture and religion to manifest itself, but though he saw it as folklore, not as religion.
One more text from a listener who writes, here's another quote, see if you can recognize it. I don't know if it's in the book or not. God is a concept by which we measure pain, by which we measure our pain. It's a song lyric. Do you know it?
I don't know it, but I love it.
God is a concept by which we measure our pain. John Lennon.
I love that. I love that line. Yes, it is. Why do we suffer? What is it? Is suffering a way to improving ourselves? Are we here in a battle against pain? And who sends us that pain? An atheist, and I can spend in a single day the whole gamut of religious connections. I might start my day as an atheist and end up my day as a deist or a spiritualist. I find that big question of suffering, why do people suffer, is one that will inevitably bring the masses back to a higher being.
Before you go, you are a professor of Latin American and Latino culture at Amherst College. What would you say in general terms about Latino contribution to religion in this country?
Yes. Latinos, some 60 to 65 million, are very devout and have been at all times. There has always been a solid presence of Catholicism, Christianity in Latin America, though Protestantism has made headways throughout that continent. There is an extraordinary transformation of Latinos when they come to the United States. Their Catholic, Christian, or Protestant views undergo a process of acclimation or adaptation. They become much more American. They engage with God less necessarily in an old-fashioned church-like way, and more in the pop culture engagement that we have. And I think the future of religion, in many ways, is in the Latino community, that time after time remains solid and connected with its beliefs, even though those beliefs mutate in the process of becoming American.
And it's a question I've asked about the anti-immigrant push by those who, were in that camp, because they tend to be conservative. They tend to be religiously affiliated, particularly with various forms of Christianity. And yet, who's coming from south of the border? It's all these Catholics and Pentecostals.
Absolutely. And if there is anybody at this point, regardless of your or my religion, that needs to be seen as human and not only as another number, are all those immigrants that are struggling to have a better life, and that have their faith as a torch that leads them. Maybe by the second generation, their children become less religious. It is said that many Americans have lost the interest in joining a church or a mosque or a synagogue or other types of religious temples, but that spirituality is on the rise in this country and has been so for the last few decades. I think that it is the immigrant right now that is the vulnerable figure that all of us, again, regardless of which God you're praying to, need to defend and embrace. We are all immigrants. We all came as immigrants. Even those that were here are migrants. And that movement has only invigorated us. It is a shame that our government has targeted immigrants in their barbaric views as undermining the most religious concepts that Christianity, Catholicism in particular, have.
Thank you for migrating to our airwaves today. Ilan Stavins, now the author of A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. Thanks so much.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.
The United States is about to mark its 250th anniversary.
And so, on the Global Story podcast from the BBC, we're telling surprising tales of American influence on the world stage and in ordinary people's lives all across the globe.
We have this ability to export our story, and a lot of people have bought it.
I feel like the American dream is alive but not well.
From the BBC, it's the United States at 250.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts or find us on YouTube.